In this video, I want to show you how to create an ambient occlusion map for your object. Now, in order to create an ambient occlusion map, we have to add a new render output. Now, there's a couple ways we can do this. Whenever you start or create a new scene, you're going to get two render outputs. You're going to get a final color and an alpha output. But what we want an ambient occlusion render output. So there's a number of ways that we can get to this result. The first way we can do it is go to the top of our shader tree where it says Add Layer, and choose from that list Render Output. Now we don't want final color, we want ambient occlusion. So if we cruise over here to the effects column, this guy right here, and change the effect of that render output, there it is, there's ambient occlusion right here. There we go. I'm going to turn off these guys real quick so we just see our ambient occlusion. Now, the preview window isn't showing us the effect of our ambient occlusion until we click on this little effects button right here. See how it says shading? If we click on it, the first options up at the top are going to be our render outputs. So let's select ambient occlusion to preview what the ambient occlusion render output is going to do. As you can see here, the ambient occlusion render output is going to give us a preview or kind of a good indication of how all the indirect rays, all the global illumination rays, are going to interact with our objects. Why we love using ambient occlusion maps in the texturing process is it gives us this nice indication of shadows. It could be dirt. So we love, it's just this little extra detail. We love ambient occlusion. It adds that sense of realism at the texture level instead of the render level. So we want to get all of this information out, and more specifically, we want to get it out of Modo and into a texture map that we can use over in Photoshop. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. First things first, let's make sure that all of our other render outputs have been deleted or turned off. I just turned mine off. Make sure that your UV map is selected. Also, let's click on our render settings here. Let's go to the Properties tab to view them. And we need to ensure that in the Frame tab, the resolution for our frame width and frame height needs to be the resolution of our texture map. So in our case, I know I want a 1024 by 1024 texture map at a DPI of 300 and a pixel aspect ratio of 1. So we're good to go. Okay, let's double check, make sure our UV map is selected, and we're good to go. Ambient occlusion map is turned on. Now, there are a couple options in the ambient occlusion map that you could change. If you select the render output and go to the Properties tab, if you bump up the occlusion rays, the quality of your ambient occlusion map is going to be much higher. But please note, it is going to take a long time to render if you bump this up. So there is a little bit of a loss there. For this purpose, I'm just going to leave it as default of 64. So I'm ready to go. Let's go to the top of the screen where it says Render, and to make an image map from our ambient occlusion render output, we choose Bake to Render Outputs. And there it goes. As you can see, the computer is kind of chugging away, just processing all the indirect rays, and it's taking all that information and baking it into a map based off of the location of our UVs. Now, this is going to take a couple seconds. The ambient occlusion map, it takes a long time to render, so we're going to give it here a second to render. Each one of those orange little buckets there, those little orange squares dancing across the screen, represents a processor. So the more processors that you have on your machine, the faster this process is going to go. And there we go. I'm all done. So like any other image that we create inside of Modo, we have to save it. And I'm going to call this create AO for ambient occlusion, and I'm going to save it right there on my desktop. The format we can leave as Targa and hit save. Okay, let's jump over into Photoshop, and I'm going to place this ambient occlusion map. There it is, and place it in my scene and hit OK. Now it comes in at the top, so if I rearrange the layer order of my scene, I can start getting my UVs back on top, and I might even put this ambient occlusion map in my diffuse texture folder. And let's open up my folder. There it is. Drag it on top of everything. But once we drag it on top of everything, we're not seeing our grain. Well, in order to use an ambient occlusion map inside of Photoshop, we have to change the blend mode for that layer. And to do that, we go to the top of the layers palette to this little pull down. The default blend mode for all of our textures inside of Photoshop is normal. But if we change the blend mode for our ambient occlusion map to multiply, you're going to see that all that white has disappeared. And now we're starting to get a clear indication of all of our shadows. Pretty cool. Pretty cool. So now we can take this image, we can bring it back over into Photoshop, or excuse me, back into Modo, and get a better indication of where all of our shadows are going to exist. So that's using ambient occlusion maps inside of Photoshop.